Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
And that's what makes us forget, this disturbing world we're living in.
Having one single thing is not actually make you a better, in this case, skater, but having a rich life.
I think that generation became really a bit cynical about the exploitation of the athletes as a political tool.
It was the ordinariness of being in the Olympic Village and just getting to know people as people that was so exciting for me.
I'm Sarah Fensky. Today, let's talk about the Olympic Games.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the athletes of the Olympic Winter Games Beijing 2022.
女士们、先生们，欢迎北京2022年冬季奥林匹克运动会运动员入场。
Now, the Winter Games now underway in Beijing are a topic Pauline Lee has a special connection to. Pauline is an associate professor of Chinese thought and culture at St. Louis University. She's director of SLU's Lived Religion in the Digital Age Initiative and also director of SLU's Asian Study program. But before she got her PhD, Pauline Lee was an Olympic athlete. She was actually the first woman to represent Taiwan in figure skating back in the 1988 Olympics. And she joins us today to tell us about it. Pauline Lee, welcome.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
So, Pauline, I understand you were born in Pennsylvania. You've always lived in the U.S. What was your connection to Taiwan?
Well, I was born in Erie, Pennsylvania. My parents come from China and Taiwan, and I grew up in Mankato, Minnesota. I do go visit Taiwan quite regularly. I'm a dual citizen, and that's how I represented Taiwan.
Okay, so you then grew up in Mankato. I assume very cold place. Figure skating was huge there.
It was everywhere. That's what we did, yes, and ice fishing.
And so how old were you when you first took to the ice as a skater?
Well, my babysitter took me and my brother ice skating quite often with her 4-H club when I was about 5 years old. So that was my first time. And then I started, a skating teacher suggested to my parents that they give me private lessons. So I started taking those and training more seriously when I was 8.
Okay, so at 8, this kind of became a thing for you. Now, we hear a lot about Olympic athletes today. Like, this is their entire life. I mean, on the ice for hours a day. Was it like that for you as an 8-year-old?
It was a lot of hours, but it was definitely not my entire life. I would skate later. I don't remember at 8 years old what I did. Probably not the same thing, but maybe by 11, I would skate in the morning from like 6 to 9, and then go to school, a normal school day, and then go to the ice rink afterwards and skate for a couple hours. So that would be about a 5-hour training day. It was never all my life, and I love hearing Nathan Chen, the now Olympic gold medalist. I love hearing him say that going to Yale and being a college student and having a rich, full life makes him a better skater. And I think that is true. Having one single thing is not actually make you a better, in this case, skater, but having a rich life.
And your parents, it sounds like they did not have, when you're a 4-year-old, they weren't like, okay, let's get her in the Olympic training program. This was all kind of because of a babysitter. What was their perspective on the work you were doing as an athlete?
They were always very supportive. They are not athletes themselves, so now I look at my daughter and my niece, and they're all really gifted athletes, so I think maybe there's something in the genes. But they're not athletes themselves. They were very supportive of whatever my brother and I were excited about and passionate about, whether it be violin or hockey, or for my brother it was swimming, and for me it was sometimes soccer or stamp collecting, and then ice skating, which was the thing that stuck for me.
So you really took to ice skating. How did you end up being recruited to skate for Taiwan?
Let's see. I believe, my memory, I'd have to go ask my parents who would know more precisely, historically, accurately. But I remember around 7th grade, I was going up the ladder in the U.S. system, so taking the United States Figure Skating Association test, skating in state competitions and regional competitions. And then the president of the Olympic Association from Taiwan, or in the Olympics, it's referred to as Chinese Taipei, came to watch me skate for a couple of days in Minnesota. And when he was about to leave, he asked me if I might be interested in skating for Taiwan. And I didn't know what that meant particularly. I just thought that sounds great. And I immediately said, yeah, definitely.
And so it was that simple. I mean, it doesn't sound like you had mixed feelings like, oh, I only want to do this if I can do this for the USA. Nothing like that.
It wasn't for me, not in 7th grade. I can totally see athletes who decide when they're 17 or 18, which there are some skaters or athletes at the Olympics now, right, who decide at that age that is a more self-conscious decision. For me, I was however old you are in 7th grade, 12, and it wasn't this, I did not think about it too much. I just love skating and I wanted to do it.
And it sounds like that decision, as quickly as you made it, that opened up some real doors for you.
Oh, absolutely, it did. And I'm really thrilled I represented Taiwan. There's like 100-some countries in the world, and I was the first one to represent Taiwan in figure skating. I think the more countries that are in the Olympics, the stronger, richer the Olympic spirit.
So we've just tweeted out a link to Pauline Lee skating in the 1987 World Championships. If you want to see her, yeah, Pauline.
Okay.
Yeah. So now everybody can find this on Twitter. That's at STL on air. Pauline, of course, now a professor at St. Louis University. Her past life was as an Olympic figure skater. So you're there in Calgary. I remember that Olympics so vividly. That was just a great Winter Olympics. Were you able to enjoy yourself during this with all the stress that's put on Olympic figure skaters?
I definitely did. I think that being able to enjoy your Olympic experience is really important. Christy Yamaguchi, who won the Olympics, the following 2 Olympics afterwards, I had the same coach as she did my Olympic year. And I remember her saying she wanted to enjoy her Olympic experience. I think that's absolutely critical. Taking out that pressure makes you a better athlete, more competitive. It was exciting. It was thrilling. And not in a way I would have expected. It was the ordinariness of being in the Olympic Village and just getting to know people as people that was so exciting for me.
So the ordinariness, this seems like just a bunch of extraordinary people, but when you were with each other, you guys were just normal young people.
Absolutely. We were just normal young people. You'd see Ekaterina Gordieva playing video games, and you'd see, I don't even remember the names of some of these Olympic champions. They're eating their bagel or their scrambled eggs or deciding they needed both. Or showing off their injuries from the bobsled. It was absolutely, trading pins was a big thing. Normal playing cards, normal people.
Those sort of ceremonial pins that you'd see on people's jackets, people were just swapping those, trying to get a full set?
Yes, that's a thing, a ritual. Swapping pins with other athletes.
So having been, I think, roughly a 10-year-old girl at the time of this Olympics, all I remember is America was just crazy. There was Debbie Thomas, there was Katarina Witt. This was this huge rivalry. Did you get to hang out with those two at all?
Not Katarina Witt. I watched her. Debbie Thomas, I trained with her for one summer, and then she also is a graduate from Stanford my same year, 1991. So I did, and I skated with her quite a bit. A thrill, totally thrill. United States women's figure skating was at the top, easily could have been 1, 2, 3, Jill Turnery, Karen Kadevi, Debbie Thomas. And some of these skaters, Karen Kadevi, we probably don't remember, really legendary skaters.
Yeah, these were some great skaters.
Yeah.
And Debbie Thomas, I mean, she was just such a phenomenal athlete, and yet it felt like there was so much pressure being put on her that was maybe kind of a foretaste of where the Olympics have gone today. Do you think she was feeling that at that Olympics?
I can only imagine. There was. The media turned it into the dueling Carmens, East versus West, the politics, one versus another. I would think that So I'm interested as a scholar in storytelling. That's one of my interests, and the power it has. And I think that the media putting on that big narrative onto these skaters puts up, I think, very difficult pressure. It also makes it more visible and makes your sport more beloved by a wider group of people, which is the benefit.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of little girls got hooked on watching figure skating that year, for sure. But as you say, there was really this East versus West narrative. This became political, that here was the skater from communist Eastern Europe, and here was America. Do you think there's a place for that in the games?
Well, I've been thinking about that. I've been watching the Olympics. When I skated in 1988, it was not a 24/7 media coverage. I wanted to be shown on TV. Everyone does, right? You want to skate on TV. And I wasn't. It was only the last two groups that are on TV. It's a very different event now. And I was thinking, is there a place for this kind of politics? There's going to be. You can't help it. There's going to be. But I really see the Olympics through the eyes of not the scholar or not the citizen sometimes, but as the 19-year-old athlete that I was at the Olympics. And I'd like to see less of that and more the viewpoint of the athlete.
We're talking today to Pauline Lee. She's an associate professor of Chinese thought and culture at St. Louis University, also directs its Asian Studies program. She was an Olympic figure skater, got to compete in the 1988 Winter Games in Calgary, and then retired from the sport after that. Now, we asked listeners, we asked about your thoughts on this Olympics. We heard from Eleanor, who's in Lebanon, Missouri, and she had some pretty strong feelings.
We would follow the games if we actually got to see the games. But what we see when we watch the games is NBC, talking heads, blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah, and interviewing people. I don't want to listen to some little girl talk about her daddy taking pictures of her. I want to see her skiing. I want to see people skiing, skating, doing what they're doing at the games. I do not want to hear their biographies, their sob story, and I don't want to hear some guy's person in the opinions, in the studio. It's ridiculous. They aren't actually covering the Olympics. So, we've just basically given up.
And that is Eleanor calling from Lebanon, Missouri. She feels like we've given up. I do feel like some of these media narratives, they're what hooked me as a kid. Mm-hmm. But Pauline Lee, do you feel like maybe we've gone a little too far with some of the soft focus, puff piece, following these athletes everywhere? Right.
So I am so sympathetic to what Eleanor says, and she puts it more passionately than I would. And I love that. I'm totally sympathetic. I think that it is too much this big media coverage, and it takes away the voices of the athletes, and they are losing agency. And it takes away from our ability to enjoy what the pureness of that sport. It's like a lot of it's sort of quirky or obscure or niche, and we lose some of that when we're trying to make it sell with big media. And I think a helpful solution is just more voices, we want more people voting in democracy. We want more people covering the Olympics. And so one of my dreams when I was watching yesterday was I was thinking, wouldn't it be great if the athletes all videoed their own thing and then turned it into some editor who was representing them and then had on a different TV station the athletes' version of the Winter Olympics.
And it sounds like you think that would be a much different version. They would tell their stories differently than NBC is doing it.
Oh, I think it'd be very different. I think it'd be really exciting. They could be in parallel then. You'd have lots of different voices. It wouldn't take away from media coverage. There's a huge benefit. They pour a lot of money into it, and it makes it so we can do these sports. But it would give the athletes a voice, or artists, like storytelling, like if Lin-Manuel Miranda went in and told the story, or if some great filmmaker, or I think that more stories, more coverage, more dimensions would give us the Olympics that maybe Eleanor is looking for.
So I really like this idea, but I do want to bring this back to your Olympic career. You retired, you were 19. Do you feel like you had done what you wanted to do at Calgary?
Yes. At that time, I felt like I had done what I wanted to do. And I had done what I wanted skating, and it was time to retire. it was also, at the same time, the kind of thing that skaters did. So Debbie Thomas went to one Olympics, Karen Kadavy, Jill Trenery. It was a kind of, you had your one chance if you were super lucky and worked really hard. And it went well or it didn't go well, or you got what you want, but that was the one chance, which gave it even more of a magic. Mm-hmm. So there's an amateur quality to it that you don't have as much these days, now that you can have sponsors.
Yeah, and people want to sustain these careers and give it another try, maybe get multiple golds, not just the one gold. For you, was it a hard transition to then be a college student? You're there at Stanford, not skating, I imagine, no longer skating 5-6 hours a day.
Right.
Was that hard?
Oh, absolutely. I'm very interested in drawing attention to, there's the climb up a very steep mountain to get to the Olympics, no matter who you are. And for a medalist, a medal contender, an unimaginably steep climb. But once you get to the top, there is a very steep climb down that is no less difficult. That I would love to see more attention paid to that for the athlete's sake, for all our sakes. We all have things, goals, aims. We go for something big, and I think paying rich attention to the down, so we can climb up the next mountain, is something we might neglect.
Sounds
in
like
our world.
Maybe just a little bit of a mental health struggle to adjust to this part of my life is over.
Oh, absolutely. I remember Michelle Kwan, the great legendary skater, once said, she was giving a guest speech, and she said, I have a very hard time finding another place where I go on the ice and they say, or go anywhere and they say, representing the United States of America, Michelle Kwan, and 10,000 people stand up. It's a big adjustment, absolutely. It's a worthwhile adjustment, but a big adjustment.
So, Pauline, for you today, I know you're very busy with your work at SLU, but do you still ice skate?
I do. I skate for fun. There was a short period of time where I didn't. You have to, I felt like, and I feel like still, you have to lay it down, something you love, in order to go find something else. And then I came back to it. I skate for fun now. I have a bucket list of places. One of my friends and I want to go skating before we turn 95.
Give me an example. What's on this bucket list?
So I did go to the Rideau Canal and skated down. It's a many, many, many mile canal in Ottawa, Canada, which was just fun, being outdoors and on a canal. And then the Amsterdam Canal freezes over sometimes. I would love to go there sometime. I would love to skate on a glacier. I saw a professional show of Brian Boitano and friends skating on a glacier. That would be just such a thrill.
Pauline Lee, I love that idea. I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah.
We do need to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to keep talking about the Olympics. We're going to talk to Susan Brownell. She's a professor of anthropology at UMSL, and she's also an expert on the Olympics and China. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome back. We're joined now by a different professor who also has a lot of great perspective on the Olympics. That is Susan Brownell. She is a professor of anthropology at the University of Missouri St. Louis. She's an internationally recognized expert on Chinese sports and the Olympic Games. She actually wrote the book on this. This is Beijing Games, What the Olympics Mean to China. Susan, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So here's a really big question just to kick things off. What do the Olympics mean to China?
Well, I think in 2008, everybody was clear that that was China's coming out party on the world stage. That was the meaning they attributed to it, and everybody else was on board that that was what it meant. But even when they were bidding, the meaning of this particular games wasn't quite as clear, and then I think the COVID epidemic complicated that. So it's not a coming out party. They've already arrived. Maybe to some extent it's an affirmation that they are here and we'd better deal with it.
They hosted the Summer Olympics there in 2008. Here they're hosting the Winter Olympics. That seems really unusual to have one city do both.
Well, they are making a big deal out of the fact that Beijing is the only city to have hosted both the Summer and Winter Olympic Games, although that is a model that Winter Olympic Games have been moving towards because it had started to outgrow the little mountain resorts that previously were hosts of Olympic Games. So even as far back as Torino, you had a pretty major city hosting the arena events, and then you had a long distance to the snow events. So the model was already there, and, Beijing put together the bid, and now they get to brag that they're the only city to have done this.
Yeah, so they have these bragging rights, but at the same time, there has been some talk about, was this really the best city to do this? That this isn't a winter sports city. How do you think they're doing so far? How are these venues holding up?
Well, the bid process itself was really considered at the time a crisis for the Olympic movement because a number of European cities had their bids scuttled by negative public opinion and domestic politics.
People just didn't want the Olympics in their backyard.
Exactly. Public referenda were coming up very negative. Finally, Beijing was left in the contest with Almaty, Kazakhstan, and Oslo, Norway. And then right before the final decision was to come out, Norway withdrew, and that, again, was really due to the fact that there had been a shift. One party had lost power, the other had come to power. They wanted to reject everything the previous party had supported, and so they withdrew the bid, and that left what at the time was called two dictatorships bidding for the Games. So probably Beijing didn't actually expect to get the Games because normally cities have to bid at least twice before they have a successful bid. And they were probably taken by surprise, and the rest of the world, certainly the International Olympic Committee didn't expect it either. So that was, the situation actually that brought us these games. Although, that said, there had been discussion in China for decades of hosting a Winter Games, although for the longest time the discussion was that it should be Harbin, which is sort of known as the ice city in northeastern China. But they just never could see Harbin's infrastructure as being sufficient. They built it up over the years, but it still didn't have enough hotels, public transportation, that kind of thing.
So Beijing stepped in, and, with China getting this Olympic Games again, of course, there's some controversy that comes with that. Now, we talked to Pauline Lee, who had skated representing Taiwan. She didn't want to talk about the political issues around Taiwan's representation at the Olympics. That has been a controversy again this year. Can you give us the short version of that?
There is no short version because it's complicated, and I've written about it, and I've basically called it word games. But what happened was China was excluded from the Olympic Games for over 30 years, and that was because it refused to take part in an organization that accepted Taiwan as a member, because their position is that we defeated the Republic of China in a civil war. They fled off to this island called Taiwan. They aren't a legitimate nation, and people need to recognize us. So when China was finally readmitted, it was under what's called the Olympic formula, and that was in 1979. And this requires Taiwan to essentially be represented as a province of China. That's what the mainland wants to happen. And so all the symbols have to suggest that Taiwan is a part of China. So it competes under the name Chinese Taipei, and under its Olympic flag, it's not allowed to use its national flag or national anthem. And this is not received well in Taiwan, and in recent years they've become increasingly militant, the public, about rejecting the Olympic formula. So something really interesting happened at this Olympic Games, because one thing they have rejected is they refuse to even march next to Hong Kong and the mainland in the opening ceremonies, because that symbolizes that Hong Kong and Taiwan are both part of the mainland.
They didn't want that visual.
They don't want the visual. And in 2008, they objected, like they always do, and an agreement was reached that they would stick the Central African Republic in between. This had to do with the order that determined by Chinese characters. And I noticed that in this Olympics, they marched in, and that was followed by Hong Kong and by China. So that was new, and apparently they had objected. They didn't want to march. They threatened to boycott the opening ceremony. The International Olympic Committee told them if they didn't show up, they'd be punished. So they came. So, this was something that's quite meaningful in that part of the world, although for us it's just kind of arcane and hard to follow.
Yeah, but as you say, very meaningful to the people in it. Something else that I'm questioning how much meaning is with this, the United States announced a diplomatic boycott of this Olympics. Australia, Britain, and Canada soon followed. A diplomatic boycott. Do we care about the diplomats? I mean, I know a lot of people want to see more skiing. They want to have more athletes. Does it matter?
Well, I'm glad you've brought up that point because, there's a really sharp-tongued spokesperson for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's actually like a new genre of spokesperson. It's really sardonic humor. And he, in an official statement, said, nobody cares if politicians come to the Olympic Games. And I had to laugh because I do think he's right. I think history tells us he's right. Because in 2008, there was actually a boycott movement that nobody remembers now. It was called Boycott the Opening Ceremony, and it involved heads of state not attending the opening ceremony as a form of protest. And although the U.S. did go, President Bush actually took a large entourage, and Australia went. But with that exception, all the nations who are doing the so-called diplomatic boycott now also did not send a head of state in 2008. And nobody remembers that now. So you do have to wonder if the Biden diplomatic boycott will be forgotten also.
Yeah, it feels like the only boycotts that we remember are the ones where the athletes are told that they have to boycott the games. You competed in the Olympic trials in 1980 and 1984. In 1980, the U.S. ended up boycotting the games. Do you think there's lessons that we can learn from what happened that year?
Well, we've already learned those lessons, actually, because, yes, I was a member of that cohort of athletes who personally had our Olympic dreams crushed, because we knew before the Olympic trials in track and field that we weren't going to Moscow. And at that time, I was still an Olympic hopeful. I didn't make the team, but, like that everybody else, I thought I had a chance. And so your dreams have been dashed. And I think that generation became really a bit cynical about the use of the Olympic game, the exploitation of the athletes as a political tool. And then that generation grew up and became the leaders in world sport. And one member of that generation was Thomas Bach, who is currently the president of the International Olympic Committee. So the result of that negative experience is that if you look closely, you realize that since the end of the Cold War, there has actually been no national boycott at all. There hasn't been any head of state that has called for keeping athletes away from the Olympic Games, and there hasn't been any National Olympic Committee that has done that. So the calls to actually keep athletes away are coming from advocacy groups, basically, and the odd politician like Nancy Pelosi.
But as far as athletes go, as far as the Olympic community, it sounds like there's a consensus like this is not something we want to do again.
The consensus is really strong in the sports world itself, with among athletes and among those people who are now leaders, who are former athletes. But actually, there is obviously a pretty strong consensus even among governments and heads of state.
Because people haven't been boycotting.
Right, exactly. So what's going on with this diplomatic boycott, obviously, is that they're able to use the word boycott, but it's not that kind of boycott, and it's kind of threading a fine needle and still making a political statement without doing, because these days, if you kept all the athletes home, I think it would not be supported by public opinion.
So there are always a lot of questions about China when it comes to things like civil rights, human rights. A member of China's Olympic Organizing Committee had warned that foreign athletes may face punishment for speech that violates Chinese law. How is that issue playing out so far? I know these Olympics are still young.
Well, I was in Beijing in 2008 and the year leading up to and including the Games. And I think what happened then is happening now, which is that once the opening ceremony arrives and the sports get started, the politics kind of dissolve into the background. And then as now there were suggestions that there might be some athletes who might want to protest on behalf of China, and there was a lot of discussion about what would happen to them. The fact of the matter is most athletes don't want to engage in political protests, but if they do, like we did have athletes expressing some support for the Black Lives Matter movement last summer in Tokyo. And of course, we've had the famous Mexico City 1968 Black Power protest. But those were athletes protesting conditions back in their home country that directly affected them. And I think athletes are a lot less likely to protest on behalf of groups in another country, when it doesn't directly affect them. So I'd be a little surprised whether we see any protests. I mean, maybe a few statements in press conferences, which is now allowed. That was not allowed previously. But, I mean, unfurling a Tibetan flag or something like that, I don't think we'll see that.
So, Susan, we've been talking a lot about the politics. And as you say, this comes down to the sports. Have you been riveted by the sports so far this year?
Oh, I have, yeah. And I think it's really amazing how the athletes always rise to the occasion and the magic of sport, in a sense, takes over. And that's what makes us forget, this disturbing world we're living in. But that said, I do think it's pretty difficult for them. These are difficult situations with fewer spectators in the stands. I'm a great figure skating fan. In fact, I knew Pauline Lee previously, when we had discussed figure skating. I recreationally skate myself. And you just really notice that even the TV broadcast isn't quite the same, without the masses of spectators in the stands. And, maybe that explains the drop-off in viewership a little bit. So, we haven't discussed the COVID pandemic, but that has really changed everything and probably had a negative impact.
Been a big issue for these games. Well, Susan Brownell, I want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise here.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
And Susan is a professor of anthropology at the University of Missouri St. Louis and an Olympics expert. This episode was produced by Emily Woodbury with audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr. Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer. St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here. If you learned something new from today's episode, consider leaving us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the easiest way to help people discover our show. We appreciate it. Thank you. St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.